our beautiful little restaurant is in a tiny village in a small part of England called Bray, which if I can plug, I would suggest you all get out there and have a look because it is quintessentially English. But inside our tiny 38-seat dining room, we try and give people what's called a multi-sensory dining experience, where we try and tap in to the way in which all our senses work together and in harmony to heighten the experience you have when eating a piece of food. And we've done this in different ways. So before I go on, I'll just explain why I'm actually here today. It's because I've been working with Helen on a couple of specific projects, which will lead on towards the back of what I'll briefly mention is where we're kind of heading, which is to start designing and creating edible items. I mean, I'll call it a cheese. I mean, it looks like a cheese, but no one's tried it. Using the skin microbiome of Heston, which is currently in display in the V&A. If you want to have a look, I've got it here. And so the idea was in this project here, we simply wanted to sample Heston's microbiome and then use the bacteria that was collected to create a Comté-style cheese as a kind of experiment to see what could be produced from a human microbiome in a very simple level. What we wanted to develop it into, and we still might, was to see how Heston's emotional state at the time of sampling would affect that flavour of that cheese. Now, that's something we haven't quite managed to do in a physical way, but it's something that we've already started to understand in the restaurant has a huge impact on not only the way that you interact with the food, but how often the food can interact with you, the other way around, if you see what I mean. So let me get back to the restaurant because it's prettier. So we do this in a number of ways already, and I guess our journey as a business has been from starting off with ingredients and techniques from traditional French cuisine, reinvented through an understanding of chemistry and science, to start in the world of sort of the business of flavour, is what I would describe it as. And so we started on a journey of creating dishes and flavours that were not necessarily conventionally put together for an understanding of their chemical makeup. And we did this in a number of ways, and we kind of evolved forwardly into an understanding that actually people's senses could often play tricks on them in the way that they receive those flavours. And I thought I'd show you a couple of dishes from the menu that we currently serve, just to kind of highlight how it works, to give you a better understanding of maybe what I'm talking about. So this is a very simple dish. It looks very, very simple, but it was actually a very important beginning for a multi-sensory journey for Heston and the team of chefs there, in the sense that this dish is presented to the diner as you see it here, and the diner is instructed to eat the orange one first. So obviously most people would use their eyes as their first indicator of sensory input to try the orange jelly here. Now the orange jelly is in fact made with a yellow beetroot and has a beetroot flavour, and the orange flavoured jelly is in fact the red one because it's made with blood orange. So as a simple trick of the senses, what we started to realise is that by playing around with what people were anticipating to eat, they were having a very different sensory experience when they ate these jellies. And that started Heston thinking and the team thinking about other ways to bring in other senses into the dining experience. And so we started to play around with the other sensory inputs. And we have this dish. So this dish is actually called oak moss and is driven by a desire to kind of heighten the aroma. Because flavour, I'm sure you'll be aware without necessarily being aware, is a mixture of two senses. It's taste and aroma. It's not one single sense. So you can start to play around with those inputs like a graphic equaliser, and if you can heighten one of them, you can maybe bring out a flavour that's elsewhere hidden on the dish. So this dish uses basically the aroma of a woodland, which is sampled from oak resin and distilled through various chemical processes to create an essential oil, which is in the bottom of this box here with some dry ice. And as the diner receives the dish, water is poured into the box, and obviously the table floods with this incredible cloud of dry ice and steam full of this oak resin aroma, which highlights one or two of the other elements of the dish. Now I've got a pointer. See, this here is a little box which contains, I'm looking at the crowd, I think most of you are too young to remember that Listerine used to do a series of breath fresheners, which were a tiny microfilm of clear material, resin, which you would place on your tongue and would dissolve instantly. Now we made these out of oak resin to heighten the sense of flavour of oak on the dish, which would then pick up this element here, which would be the truffle. So what we were trying to do is connect the experience of enjoying a truffle and obviously the aroma and feel of being in an oak woodland, which is the natural habitat of a truffle most of the time, to try and, I suppose, obviously heighten the experience of the dish, but also it was the beginning of a journey to insist that all our dishes have this multi-sensory angle. It was no longer just enough that they taste nice and have a good flavour. We always wanted to have things on the plate or on the table in front of the diner to help them get a different sensory input and to heighten the experience. But we began to learn as we did this, and it led to another dish, which one or two of you may be aware of if you're aware of Heston's work, but this is called Sound of the Sea. Now, Sound of the Sea was driven by a desire to somehow bring in the sense of hearing into a dish. Now, it's not something that naturally is available. Obviously, the ambience of a restaurant and conversation is very important, but we wanted to play around with the very important nostalgic power of sound. Now, coming out of these headphones is obviously a very specially produced soundscape of an English seaside town. So as you eat this dish, the idea is that you place the headphones in your ears and you listen to this soundscape while enjoying what is essentially a beautiful collection of everything from razor clams and oyster and a lovely sort of seabed of edible sand and lots of different textures and flavours. But really the goal was to see the impact of heightening an oral experience to the sensory input of the flavour that you're tasting on your tongue. And it was driven out of an experiment where we learnt that, interestingly, and it's something that when you talk about the commercial end of things, a lot of big businesses, a lot of food manufacturers have already started to play around with this area for many, many years. But in the world of crisps, the sound of crunching in your ears can often mask the flavour and texture of what are essentially quite stale crisps. So we realised that if you listen to the sound of crunching in your ears while eating stale crisps, you actually perceive them as much fresher than they really are. And that's why a lot of crisps are presented to you in very foily, crunchy bags, because what they want you to do is hear crunching sounds as you're eating the crisp to heighten the flavour reception. So through the process of this particular dish, having gone through the journey of aroma and smells and flavours together to bring in the idea of sound, we suddenly realised that actually people's connection with their senses was something much more powerful. And it began to open up a doorway of our emotional connection with our senses and also with our memories, because one of the key learning journeys of this particular dish was that when it worked, it was incredibly powerful. When it worked best is when people had a strong emotional connection with the seaside. So either they grew up there or they spent many years on holiday, whatever it was, the power of that dish would be heightened to a level that we hadn't necessarily expected, and would often, it sounds flippant, but people would cry in the dining room sometimes with emotional power of this dish that took them to a place that we hadn't anticipated. So really, it was a moment where we realised we were no longer in the business of selling flavour. We were in the business of selling emotion. We were always trying to give everyone a positive emotional outcome to the meal, but we realised that actually the way we could do it was not how we first expected we could. And so it led us into a journey of, I suppose, exploration, but to start to try and understand how we can harness the power of people's emotions, we had to start to try and understand people themselves, which, as we all know as individuals, is incredibly complex and change with the breeze, and how you can ensure that someone's emotional state is in the right place to receive a plate of food when they come to your restaurant is very difficult. When people arrive, they may have just had a really complicated journey, they might have had an argument with their partner or friends on the way, and we don't know, but we were trying to work out how can we get people to be in the right emotional state to receive the food and come out with a positive outcome. A journey we're still on, by the way, so the next slide doesn't necessarily give you the answer to that, so don't get too excited. I suppose where we are now as a restaurant is this. So this is the current menu at the Fat Duck, right, which looks like a sort of, well, it's a map. And so what we tend to do now is we no longer design the menu in the traditional way with different courses of 3 and 3 and 3, starter, main, dessert. But actually the journey is now a multi-sensory holiday journey round this made-up island based on Heston's ideal holiday with his family, and you travel through the different sensory areas. So you go through a forest, through the seaside, maybe you stop at a glade, you have a cocktail, and so it's a story. And so going back to the idea that we're all biodesigners in the restaurant field, I guess what we've started to realise as a restaurant and as a restaurant group is that we're trying to understand how human beings work. And something Suzanne was talking about in the slide with the different elements was the microbiome. Well, I can't remember what was on the 7 o'clock area of the slide, but it's to do with kind of trying to understand these new science techniques that we have to try and understand who we are and how we work. And obviously the microbiome plays a very important role in how we digest our food, but actually it plays a very important role in how we perceive and anticipate our food. And so our emotional connection with the microbiome is, I suppose, the area that, as a restaurant, and certainly as an individual, Heston and the team and I are very, very focused on. So actually I found your talk incredibly informative, so I'll be questioning you, I think, in the Q&A, because that's the kind of area that we're finding ourselves being led into as a commercial entity. It isn't our goal to design products which are necessarily driven by biodesign, but actually we're realising that by having this understanding of biodesign from the human perspective, we can now take what we know from our understanding of the senses and emotion and nostalgia, and maybe take it into new products and new commercial areas that we didn't think we would be doing sort of 5-10 years ago. So that's where we're sort of focusing our time. So, I mean, this is a very low rent slide, so apologies for that. I knocked it up about 10 minutes ago. So these are the kind of elements that we're trying to understand now and how they input the human experience in a restaurant environment, but also outside in the commercial sector, because we make food products for Waitrose and other people. So we're always trying to look at, obviously, if that's meant to represent the microbiome, obviously our DNA, and then finally our emotions, which we, I suppose I think, and I know sort of, Heston certainly, is very passionately in the belief that the emotions are the most important thing a human being has as a whole being, and obviously can influence the other two factors in different ways. And it's our emotional connection with those two elements, and also with ourselves and our own emotion and our relationship with them is going to play an enormous part in the way people interact in the restaurant space, but also in our own daily lives with our food and the food that we eat. And certainly, we start to research new sorts of meat and food products and all things made with different substrates and chemicals and all sorts of stuff. At the heart of it, it's going to rely on our relationship with them, as to how much benefit we're going to gain from them. And I think if we can have a much healthier relationship with our emotions, we can have a much healthier relationship with the food that we consume, the way that we produce it, and then obviously with ourselves. And I think that's the future for our restaurant group in Biodesign, in the sense that we are trying now actively to understand that world as best we can, and then I suppose design a restaurant experience off the back of it that can hopefully educate, but illustrate, but certainly have some fun in that area, so that people leave us, first of all, having a positive emotional experience, but secondly, maybe understanding a little bit more about who they are. And there's just wanted to leave you with one thought, but there's it's a very old phrase in the food world, which is, show me what you eat and I'll show you who you are. But I think now, I suppose we're going to turn that on its head. And if you can show us who you are, we can show you what to eat and how to eat it. I guess is the way the future of certainly our world in the restaurant scene is going to move. And I'm very excited to be part of it. And I'm looking forward to the questions, because I'm learning with every time one of these people speak here. So